my story and how I became involved in this issue is rather complex and goes back over 40 years. My uncle was the senior project engineer that designed the lunar module, which was the thing that landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong in it in 1969. And I was a young boy when he was working on that and had an interest in space and all of that because of family. But also around that time, when I was about 8 or 9, I saw a beautiful, seamless disc, round-shaped craft in daylight in the afternoon with some boys in the neighborhood where I grew up in North Carolina, in Charlotte. And there was a Douglas missile plant there at the time, and I think that perhaps they were investigating this missile plant. But we saw it and then it just vanished. It didn't float away, but it was hovering silently. And I became extremely interested that I had seen something from another world. And so I began to look into this matter a great deal. And as time went on, I really got involved very heavily and had a number of experiences with these ET spacecraft and the beings on board them over when I was a young man, late teenager. But in 1990, started an organization known as the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which is CSETI for short, C-S-E-T-I. And it's a nonprofit, and its main prime purpose is to create groups of people to go out to areas like you have in Norway, where these objects have been seen, and not just observe them, but to interact, to signal to them, and to interact with the intelligence behind the spacecraft. So that we began to do in 1990. And of course, we immediately began to have amazing successes. We went down to near Opan, Belgium, near the German border. We had a massive triangular craft that came right over us, vibrating with the tones we were sending up. We went to Florida, near Pensacola, and did an experiment on the beach there by the Gulf of Mexico, and had 4 of these objects appear, signaling to us with lights back and forth for about 20 minutes. It was on the front page of the paper the next day, and it was witnessed by 40 or 50 people, 2 of whom were Air Force pilots. And we then went to Mexico near the volcano Popo, the large volcano, and we had an incredible encounter with a massive ship that was about 800 feet on each side of a triangle, almost 3 football fields on each side. And it came over and hovered over us and turned and was signaling with us while we were contacting the pilot on board. And these began to happen more and more. And so by 1993, our group concluded that not only was it possible for humans to make peaceful diplomatic contact with these visitors, but that it was very important that the world know this. So we started a project that's known as the Disclosure Project, which people can see at disclosureproject.org, where we began to identify military and corporate and CIA intelligence officers who had personal knowledge of the classified operations dealing with this subject, and to get them to come forward with our information to disclose this publicly. And that Disclosure Project really began in 1993. And around that time, of course, I was asked to brief President Clinton's team and his first CIA director, R. James Woolsey. So between 1993 and the year 2000, we spent a great deal of time not only putting together the evidence and the proof, which is available at disclosureproject.org, but meeting with members of the Senate Intelligence Committee in the United States, meeting with former ministers of defense in Great Britain, people who were in the White House staff, and of course very high officials at the Pentagon, including the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, to name a few. And also at this time, the UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, his family were very interested in this, and his wife Leah Ghali became very interested, and we met with her and gave briefing materials for them. So it was a public education effort, because what we felt was necessary was that the secrecy should be ended and this information disclosed, so that humanity, not just one country, in America, but all of humanity could make peaceful contact with these civilizations visiting us, but also would lay the foundation for these new technologies, the energy and propulsion systems that are behind these UFOs that are so mysterious. How are they flying? Well, this is understood, but they are in classified projects. So that was another objective, was to get the technologies out to the public so we could have a civilization that would get freed from the use of oil and the destruction of the environment. This is a very good question. How do you get all these sort of people to come forward on a subject that is the object of so much social opprobrium, ridicule, and threats? I mean, you know, people's lives have been taken to keep this secret. I remind people that the 1951 Canadian top secret memo written by Wilbur Smith stated very directly that not only were these flying saucers, as they were called back then, real, but that it was the most classified secret in the United States, exceeding the secrecy of the development of the hydrogen bomb in the 1950s. So it's very, very, very secret. And the way that we approached this was to first articulate a vision. What good would come from disclosing this? Okay? Well, first of all, it would put the legal constitutional governments of the world back in control, because they're not in control now. President Clinton had no control over this matter. People close to President Kennedy and President Carter have told me they had no control over the management of this issue. It was taken out of their hands and has been illegally, by rogue elements within the corporate, aerospace, military intelligence community, been run under the radar screen, secretly. So that would be a very important outcome, because it would put the rule of law and civilization back in control of a very important issue. But also, I think that the way we got people to come forward was that we didn't say, come forward just with one person. We waited until we had hundreds. And when we first came forward in 2001 at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and this was broadcast all over the world, we had at that time over 110 of these military and intelligence officers who had been filmed, and there were about 22 of them at the press conference. But we put out transcripts of testimony of dozens and dozens of these men, and they came out together. And so in a large number, there's security and there's credibility. Because if only one person who's a radar operator for the Strategic Air Command says he saw something, well, you can say, oh, he saw nothing, he was imagining, he's lying. If you have 12 credentialed people with top secret clearances who said that they have tracked these on radar and have seen how it's been kept secret, then that becomes dispositive. That becomes the proof. So we wanted to have that critical mass, and it also gave these men and a few women the sense that it would be done seriously and that they would have the support of their colleagues. And so before we ever came public, we got them all together as a group, you see, and many of them. And so this encouraged them to come forward, and that's what we continue to do. Many people ask the question, how have we been able to reach all the officials in government? I think a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned, the vision behind what we're doing. People know, people who are in the know. I don't mean in the UFO community, but I mean in senior ranks of government, not just in the United States, but in Europe and around the world, know that we've actually made contact. And this gets a great deal of attention to these high officials. Secondly, they know that we're doing this in a very truthful way, in a very direct way, with serious purpose. So they know that we're not going to waste their time. And thirdly, we have relied on networking. I tell people I was just a country doctor in North Carolina when I started this. You know, I was working in an emergency department. My background is emergency trauma medicine. And when I had the idea to do this, it was very much an idea. I did not have the network. But over a period of years, we made this network, and people who did know senior officials at the Pentagon and senior people in the government and in the Congress came to me. I didn't find them. They found me and said, look, I think this is very important. I can set up a meeting with Senator Bryan, who at the time was on the Senate Intelligence Committee, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So it all unfolded very organically, like a flower. And it's really been quite an adventure. But it wasn't because I had any family connections to these people. It was all through networking. And I think the power of the message is that it's really time for the secrecy to end, and for us to make peaceful contact with these visitors, and for the technologies that are behind these objects to be the new energy source to run the planet, so that there's sustainability, the end of poverty, the end of pollution, and the end of the environmental crisis. This is a very big issue. Of course, on the other side is people who do not want that to happen, and they are very powerful. And I have met with them as well, many of them. And some of them support what we are doing and some don't. And I think in the early days, I'm talking the 1930s, 1940s, they didn't really know what they were dealing with. They also did not understand the technologies. And I think that they also didn't know why these visitors were here. For example, the big increase in all the sightings around the world happened at the time when we began to detonate nuclear weapons. This is not an accident. And I've been told by senior intelligence officials that essentially a big red flag went up over our planet saying we were in trouble. But not only are we in trouble, but we could be a threat to others, because you combine going into space, the early stages of space travel, and the use of hydrogen bombs and nuclear weapons, and a civilization on Earth that was still very violent, as you look around the Earth even today, of course. So this is something that any enlightened or even self-interested civilization observing the Earth, which I think we've been under observation for thousands of years, would be greatly concerned. But our military and government were completely shocked by this and didn't know what to do with it. I think that's the early, but later, I understand, of course, President Eisenhower wanted to make an announcement about this after he had a meeting near Edwards Air Force Base in 1954. But he was prevented from doing so by what he later called the military-industrial complex, because the interests for secrecy really fall into three broad areas. One is the inertia of the secrecy. Once you start something secret and you have made so many lies and frankly killed so many people and threatened so many people, and you've lied to Congress and you've lied to presidents, how do you bring this out? They painted themselves into a black box, black corner. The other, so that's the inertia. The other is that there were orthodox religious interests that did not know what to make of this. And I've had discussions with senior levels at the Vatican to discuss this. And today, most mainstream religious groups would say, well, there's one supreme being in the universe, and there are many children of God, and we're all children of God. This is what Monsignor Balducci said when we interviewed him at the Vatican. But the Orthodox and fundamentalists would view this in a very disturbing way, because it would upset their worldview. And I think then the biggest became the technological and scientific end of this. Once we retrieved, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, several of these extraterrestrial vehicles and began to study them, we combined that knowledge with knowledge we already had. Because remember, we had some people like T. Townsend Brown and the B-Field-Brown effect who were studying anti-gravity quite independent of this issue back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But when their information got combined with studying these spacecraft, they figured out, this is how they're working. And they realized it's the end of oil. It's the end of the need for coal. It's the end of the combustion engine, the internal combustion engine. It's the end of transmission lines for electricity, because the energy that these spaceships are using, what people call UFOs, we don't call them, no one in the business calls them UFOs. They are not unidentified and they don't fly. And we'll get to this. But these objects are extracting energy from the fabric of space, okay, around, not outer space, but the fabric of space. And in fact, even the early Lockheed and Northrop experimental spaceships that we have built, and we're talking 1950s and 60s, were called flux liners because they were pulling energy from the quantum flux field, what's called the quantum flux field that's in the space in this room. And every cubic centimeter of space, for example, in this room has enough energy to run the Earth for a day. It's a huge amount of energy. And so once this was really figured out by the mid-50s, long time ago, 50 years ago, they knew that this would be the end of the oil cartels and the international financial petrodollar system, and a huge amount of the industrialists would then have to change their whole way of operating. Because think about it. What happens when every village in India or sub-Saharan Africa can have a device that looks like a generator and it's extracting energy from this quantum flux field? Suddenly, you have an economic growth all over the world. And this is a wonderful thing. It would be the end of poverty. But it would also be the end of the economic hegemony, where Europe and America, with 600 million people, dominate the whole global economy of 6 billion. So this is a huge geopolitical problem. And so the issue isn't about just money, it's about power. Who has the power? How the Earth is run? Who is running Earth? And then you have another issue. And that is, there are people who view the world as they understand it. And in America we have a saying, if you wear rose-colored glasses, you see everything in the world is rose-colored. But if you're wearing glasses that are conflict-colored, colored with a sort of paranoid and militaristic view of the world, you're going to view these visitors as a threat, and you're going to respond to them as a threat, even though there's no evidence that they're a threat. I want to be very clear on this. There's no objective evidence that anyone has been harmed by these visitors, and there's certainly no evidence that they're a threat to us. There's a lot of evidence, however, that they're concerned about our threat to the peace and the order of space. Why? Because our technological capabilities and our weapons have surpassed our social and spiritual development, clearly. And we are at that stage in the evolution of a global civilization where our science and technology has gotten way out there, but our social and spiritual is lagging. And this is that danger zone. And Earth is in this danger zone now. And they know this. These visitors from other civilizations, other planets, know this. So, unfortunately, I think that they have had a great concern about our nuclear facilities. We know this. We have colonels and lieutenant colonels who are Strategic Air Command and the Atomic Energy Commission who have testified at disclosureproject.org that every single one of our nuclear weapon storage areas have been visited by these ET spacecraft because they were obviously concerned. And in the Soviet Union also, in Russia. We have spoken to people with the KGB and with their space command. And so it's clear that they have that concern, but that doesn't mean that they're hostile towards Earth. I think they're concerned about human hostility. And I think, however, this has gotten misinterpreted because here's the risk. In the vacuum of secrecy, when you have this vacuum of secrecy, it's very easy to begin to believe your own worldview, and there's no one telling you differently. This is the danger of a program being hermetically sealed and kept this secret, because they do not get the perspective and it's gotten out of control. And Eisenhower said when he left office in 1961, beware the military-industrial complex, because it can become a threat to our security, our way of life, and our democratic institutions. And he was a five-star general and a conservative Republican, but he was very concerned. And why? We have people who worked with him in the White House at that time who have told us, who are witnesses for our group, that he had been stabbed in the back by people who wanted to keep this secret and actually trumped or violated his presidential power and took these projects and hid them deeper and deeper and deeper. This is a very dangerous thing in a world where you're dealing with technologies this powerful. And this was, of course, President Clinton's frustration. President Clinton asked Webster Hubbell, who was third in command at Justice, to look into two things. And this is in his book, Webster Hubbell's book, Friends in High Places. Clinton wanted him to find out about what are these UFOs, and, you know, well, who's keeping it secret and why, and who killed Jack Kennedy, because Jack Kennedy was his hero. Well, we discovered there was a connection. But, and his CIA director, R. James Woolsey, was equally worried, because when I met personally with Woolsey here in the Washington area in December of 1993, he was very gravely shaken by the fact that there was a secret cabal or a whole level of government and corporate activity dealing with this issue that was lying to him as the CIA director and as also to the president. So this is a very serious problem, and so the secrecy is related to a number of related issues. One is this inertia that happens when you have this large ongoing historical problem of secrecy. The other is certain orthodoxies of both religion and science that people don't want out. Because obviously, if you own a trillion-dollar oil field or a company that's assets are in that range, remember, this is not particularly good news for you. It's good news for humanity and for the earth and for the environment. But there's only a few hundred people and corporations who really control the world economy. And this information would change forever their grip on that power. Now, they would still have a lot of money, but it's not about money. You and I think of money, can I afford to put my son or daughter to college, or buy a home, or what have you. They're viewing it as power, the geopolitical control. So it's a power issue. And this would change geopolitics forever. A very good question. How is control on the issue exerted? And it's through a number of means. First of all, through just pure corruption and intimidation. You should not underestimate the reach of folks who want to keep this secret, their ability to pay for people in the media to kill stories or change them or ridicule them, the ability to corrupt people in certain financial and governmental positions. And I've seen it happen, personally seen it happen. I've been approached by the former head of Army intelligence and by his minions to be bought off, to not tell the truth about this. And I told him to go away. But most people would not say go away. And particularly when it's attended by threats. And so the power of ridicule, the power of threats, and the power of inducements, position, money, what have you. But I think most importantly is psychological. It's a psychological phenomenon. Because if you create enough false information, what's known as disinformation, that makes the subject seem ridiculous or frightening, people don't want to hear about it. And it closes doors automatically. And since there is no large-scale institutional support or funding or professional effort on this issue, but before what we had done, there was nothing. There was hobbyists and volunteer organizations and what have you. It's very easy to do this because you can control the worldview on it by creating videotapes and movies and books that either frighten people and turns them off or makes it seem so ridiculous that they dismiss it as nonsense. And that is psychological warfare planning. And we have a document from 1953 from the CIA where they specifically talk about this, and this is in our books, where they specifically talk about the psychological warfare value of the UFO subject. Okay, so this has been over 50-some years of psychological warfare conditioning. I have a family member who was the city editor of the Boston Globe, a very prestigious newspaper in the United States. And she told me that even if we put an extraterrestrial body on her desk, she would not run a story about it in the Boston Globe because the subject has been the object of so much tabloid nonsense that it would be disreputable for them to talk about it. So a lot of the mainstream media won't touch the subject. They won't touch it, no matter how much positive evidence you give them. That has not changed much in 50 or 60 years. Occasionally it makes its way. And then the other issue is this. One of the big misperceptions, it's a very serious misperception, is that the big media is free in the West. It isn't. In fact, Pravda and the Chinese news agency have more accurately portrayed what we're doing than the Washington Post or the New York Times or ABC News in the United States. The reason for this, and as I understand it, it can be traced back to a number of documents, one of which is a fairly recent one from 1991. And if you go to disclosureproject.org, you'll see I wrote a paper called Media Play, and it's linked to a CIA document that got accidentally declassified and I understand was later reclassified. And on page 6 of that document, it talks about the fact that the intelligence community has at every major wire service, news magazine, and television network, not just the United States, but around the world, agents embedded in those media to kill, alter, change stories as needed. Well, you know, the public out there is very naive about thinking that we have a free and unfettered press. We do on small issues, but on these sort of big issues, it's very controlled. And I tell people they should read a book called Into the Buzzsaw that Gore Vidal wrote the foreword for, that talks about mainstream journalists who's discovered very hot issues, not this issue necessarily, but how they were cut down and went into this buzzsaw of being completely eliminated from being able to tell the story to the people, not just in America, but around the world. So once you get into the large corporate international media, they're plugged into the international corporate finance and international interest. And I am very skeptical that they're really that free. And the reason I say this is that I've seen it firsthand. I had an executive producer at ABC News in New York who wanted to do a huge expose using Disclosure Project military witnesses. And he was all ready to do this. And he controlled major news magazines like 2020 and Primetime Live. And when it came time for him to go into production, he called me, he said, "Dr. Griър, I can't make this." I said, "Why not?" He says, "They won't let me." I said, "Who are they?" He said, "Dr. Griъr, you know who they are." It's a very shadowy, powerful, and by the way, it's not U.S., it's transnational. Big mistake people make about this. They think that, oh, well, it's American or it's British. It isn't. Forget all the national boundaries and visualize a permanent international geopolitical entity that wants to keep these sort of things secret because of the interlocking financial and economic interests. That's what we're talking about. It isn't as simple as saying it's the U.S. government. Most of the people in the U.S. government, I would say, and this is what shocks people, our biggest supporters have been people at the Pentagon who have been lied to about these projects and are furious and know that there is a shadowy, illegal, rogue group that is running this. And in fact, even at the Congress, when I was meeting with senior counsel for the Senate Appropriations Committee 13 years ago, in 1994, they told me that there was somewhere upwards of $100 billion US a year being siphoned out from various agencies into these super secret projects, and they had no control over it. And this man who had a top secret clearance and subpoena power personally told me that they'd gotten very close to discovering who was really behind the secrecy for the UFO issue, but they hit a lead wall. And he looked at me in the eyes, he said, "Dr. Griъr, you're dealing with the varsity team of all black projects. Good luck." So it's a very, very complex issue, and the secrecy isn't that hard to maintain if you have this sort of infiltration into major institutions, media, and also the ability simply to float nonsensical stories out there. Because people hear the word UFO and extraterrestrial, they think somebody from a trailer park in West Virginia who's floated on board a spacecraft had sex with someone from Mars and claims they have a baby in an incubator. Or, you know, just all kinds of nonsense. The truth of it is actually more interesting. The truth of the technologies and the fact that the extraterrestrial technologies are so advanced that they interface directly with coherent thought. Like we have coherent light in a laser, they have technologies that interface with thought, that interface with conscious mind, that their development of artificial intelligence that's integrated into these spacecraft is so advanced that they pick up on a directed... it's fascinating. And this is what we've been experimenting with. And the whole paradigm becomes a new paradigm of understanding the structure of the cosmos. But most of the information that's out in the public on this issue has been a carnival of silliness. And that keeps most serious people sort of in the closet on it. In fact, it's interesting, I often work with senior government officials in Europe and in Canada and elsewhere, and they go, oh, you know, we're very interested, I want everything you have on this, but no one can know that I'm interested because it'll ruin my career, because I'll be ridiculed. So it's a very interesting psychological matrix that's been created to keep people in the box. And what we're trying to do is do something serious, push the envelope on this information, and credible, and get people to understand what the truth is. It's a very common question of why don't these visitors make themselves more obvious. And what I point out to people is they have. They have been filmed hovering over Rome for an hour. They have been filmed over downtown Montreal. I have the video. They have been seen all over Mexico City and on radar. They have been filmed over the White House and the Capitol and the photograph of the 1950s. They have landed and met with officials who then betrayed that. They have done everything but forcibly say this. Now, important, what good would come from one civilization forcing on another civilization their presence? This is our problem, not theirs. We've lied to each other. We've kept this secret. We have the proof. We have the materiel, the spacecraft. We have the full documentation. We have radar tapes. And what the Disclosure Project is doing that. But it's not their place, these visitors from other planets, to force their presence on us. Because to the extent that we are lying to each other in this dysfunctional human family, what that says to them is that we're not ready for that level of open contact. And so this is something that I think is a very key thing, is that if you go to a civilization that's less developed and overtly and forcibly impose your presence, it never works. This is the mistake that is happening now in Iraq, where we're going into a country and thinking we're going to impose a Jeffersonian democracy to a people who have never had anything but dictatorships and what have you. It isn't practical. And so what they're looking for, in my opinion, is that they have given us enough evidence to educate the world that we're not alone. Why are we covering this up? Why are humans? Why are governments? Why are corporations? Why don't we tell the truth? And I think that to the extent we do, we will see that they're ready to be more open. Now, the other point is that what agency on earth is assigned the task of interfacing with them? They're not interested in just the Norwegians or the Americans or the French or the Chinese. They're interested, because they are global civilizations, they are interested in human Earth civilization. But the United Nations has no mandate to deal with this. We've tried. They refuse. They're too afraid. and they've been threatened. I know for a fact that they were threatened not to when we asked them. So CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, is a citizens diplomacy effort. And we have people going out all over the world. I mean, in Australia, South America, Europe, United States, where we have teams using certain protocols attempting to make contact peacefully. And of course, we have not the funding of a government, we don't have the equipment and what have you, but it's a prototype, experimental diplomatic effort. And we have had amazing results. And the reason we have is that they want that kind of contact, but they want it when people are ready for it. And the sign that we're ready for it is when we ask for it. So it's really more the secrecy and the fact that these visitors from other civilizations and other parts of the universe are not forcibly exposing themselves to us is an act of compassion on their part. Obviously, if they wanted to, they could. They have chosen not to because their measurement of how ready we are is how we react. And we have failed that test so far. And I think that this is something that takes a lot of introspection and courage from our leaders. This is why when I meet with people in the governments, I say, look, they are waiting for an appropriate response from the earth. Inappropriate. We've fired at them. We've tried to get their technologies to reverse engineer them so we can have them secretively. We have denied them. We've ridiculed the issue. We've lied to each other. We've covered it up. We've done everything but do something appropriate, peaceful, reaching out to them, and be open and honest about it. So that is the next step. And some government in the world, I don't care what government, Norway, needs to lead that, be the leading edge of that. And until then, our group is trying to do this with our humble resources. I mean, obviously, we don't have the resources of a government. I think that part of it is that there has been so much virulent disinformation put out into the public. And you have to understand, you say these investigators and researchers, most of them are housewives or businessmen. They have an interest as a hobby. And they're not going to be able to distinguish between a false case and disinformation that's put out by counterintelligence from a shadowy military operation or corporate operation and the real thing. How are they going to distinguish? And so there's a lot of confusing information, and it's very difficult. I tell people it takes years to get, it's like peeling away layers of an onion. And you've peeled away 38 layers and you still have 20 more to go. Because it is an enigma wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in a total black hole of deception. Most of the information put out there to the public and to these investigators is deliberate disinformation designed to evoke a response. Fear and ridicule, one of those two. And this is why you see so many things about, alien invasion week on the networks, and they're invading us, or they're abducting us, or they're torturing us, or there's nothing of the kind happening. But there's plenty of ways to put that information out there and convince certain people there are. And humans have this predilection to liking to be afraid. It's like people like to go to horror movies, and people like to be frightened. But more importantly, people who want to control a large number of people or keep something secret, you do it through fear. And it isn't hard to do. I mean, I have documents from private institutes who talk about the use of stagecraft, I'm quoting, so that they are artificially staging certain UFO events and abduction events for their psychological warfare value. And I encouraged a man in England to write a book called MILAB, Military Abductions, where it talks about this. And the value of it is that it puts out a certain patina of fear that can manipulate large numbers of people. Because one of the long-term agendas for this secrecy, which Werner von Braun, who was the Nazi German I should say, perhaps. He'd said he really wasn't a Nazi, but he worked with Hitler's and developed the V-2 rocket. He was brought into the U.S. space research program back after World War II, and his spokeswoman for the last 4 years of his life is on our team. And she said, oh yes, he knew about this, and he said to her that there's an enormous amount of disinformation on this subject because their agenda long-term, this huge $1 trillion a year military industrial project, is to grow that industry so that the whole world becomes united against a threat from outer space. There is no threat from outer space, but if you can convince people there is, instead of spending $1 trillion a year out of the global economy, we'll spend $2 or $3 or $5 trillion a year. And that's the agenda behind the secrecy. But in order to do that, people have to have an enemy, and you have to manufacture fear. And so the average person who investigates this issue has not had access to Wernher von Braun's spokespeople or to the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which we have. And they are completely vulnerable to a lot of false information. And I say this, and I say this with some compassion, at least 90% of all information out there on this subject is some form of deliberately implanted false information designed for a certain agenda. And so I tell people they need to be very skeptical, and it takes a great deal of research to find out, to get to the bottom of it. Well, the Disclosure Project is an ongoing initiative, as is the CSETI project to make contact, which we call the CE5 initiative, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. And the Disclosure Project is moving forward with a number of governments around the world, as well as the United States government, to identify people who want to see this done. And we've recently had conversations with some of the new chairmen of committees at the Congress. We're working very closely with the Honorable Paul Hellyer in Canada, who used to be the Minister of Defense for Canada. We're working very closely with a very powerful European country to effect disclosure, and they are cooperating. I can't say who this country is, which country it is, but it's a very significant development. So we're continuing to put the information out, but also work and coordinate with various governments around the world to make that happen. And we've actually, in the last 6 months, have had some very positive breakthroughs. In addition to that, we continue to put these contact teams together, which has gotten the attention of a couple of different governments around the world who are supporting contact peacefully and are wanting to work with us for peaceful contact. So this is a very positive development, and we hope that bears fruit in the next few months to a year or so. So that's really where we're going with that, and we continue to train people to do this, because I believe that Rupert Sheldrake, you may have heard of, has an interesting theory about morphogenic fields, and how when a certain number of people start to do something, it picks up a sort of power non-locally that influences. And I think that the more there are people who understand the subject and move in the direction of positive contact and a positive outcome for the future of Earth, that reality will be manifested. That reality will appear. And so I think it's very important for people not to sit around waiting for Norway government or United States government to act. We are people who are conscious. We can act. And the mind, the human mind, is very powerful. And a group of people working together who are conscious with the right intention can make amazing things happen. And that's what we're encouraging people to do. The spiritual implications of this are profound. Now, I distinguish that from religious, organized religions. But I think that what's very important and what's key to our perspective on this is that Erwin Schrödinger, who was the father of quantum mechanics and particle wave theory, stated 100 years ago or so that the total number of minds in the universe is one. And in fact, that the consciousness is a singularity, phasing within all beings. And this is also the heart of compassion of the Buddha and the source of the oneness spoken of in spirit in all the religious traditions and Native American traditions. And I think that we are going to have to return to a very deep spiritual understanding of what it means to be a conscious being, to be able to not only live on this planet peacefully and not blow each other up over sectarian differences, but also to go into space. Because when you look into the eyes of an extraterrestrial life form, they may be very different from us in many ways, but if you see that that being is conscious, and the light of that conscious spirit is the same as the conscious light within yourself, then you can find some common basis. And that is going to be the common basis. And this is why the motto of CSETI is one universe, one people. That within the understanding of the true nature of mind, the true nature of the conscious mind is that it's a singularity. And that we may see, I have my individuality, you have yours, everyone does. But I say our individualities are like different beautiful windows in a cathedral of different shapes and colors. But the light streaming through those windows is from a single source. And so if we understand the single source of the origins of our conscious being, this is true not only for humans, but it's also true, very much true, for these visitors. They understand that, because you cannot travel at multiples of the speed of light without crossing the light barrier. And when you do, you enter into this area that the mystics used to call the etheric, astral, conscious realm. And so you're dealing with civilizations who understand that. And I think that is the big test of our civilization at this time, is that we understand that deeply enough that it really does change our paradigm. And when we do, we're not going to be blowing each other up because of different interpretations of this Bible or this Quran or this religious figure or what have you. That we're going to understand that we really are all one people in the entire cosmos. I think the work that we're doing now could have been done 100 years ago if someone could articulate the elements. And my sole purpose is to try to articulate and give expression to the elements, all the components. But I think that today there are more people who are aware that not only are we not alone, remember at least half the people in America think that these UFOs are real and something's being kept secret. But I think that more importantly, more and more humans are skeptical of the demagoguery that goes with dividing people. And more people are saying, now wait a minute, we're all one people on this planet. Perhaps we're all one people in the cosmos. And that's what we're trying to say, is that we're really all one people in the entire universe. And that universal consciousness and universal understanding, to me, is the thing that will truly transform life on this planet and is the next big leap in human development.